Hello, my name is Hannah Hooper, and this is the Old Testament Survey Outline. Today I'll be talking about the Old Testament, and I'll begin by going over some structure of the Old Testament. It's composed of 39 books, beginning with some themes. There's a five-fold pattern which covers 5 themes. Beginning with the origin, there is the Torah, which is composed of the first 5 books of the Bible. We go into the history books, which theme is deliverance. Then you go into the poetic books, which has a theme of communion with God. And the prophetic books have a theme of trials with God. The consummation is the entrance of the New Testament, where you see Jesus' life and the expression of the long-awaited Messiah, which is discussed quite a bit in the Old Testament. Going into the origin, which is the Torah, it outlines God's initial relationship with the world and humanity. We see the beginning, also the fall, the flood, and Babel in Genesis. We go into Exodus, where God's people rebel and end up in Egypt, as well as their rescue from Egypt by a gracious God. Going into Leviticus, it shows God's desire to have fellowship with his people. And God's people do not want to enter into the land of God and continue to rebel. However, it outlines his ways and his character through the giving of the law, as well as his nature in that law. Numbers is more of a genealogy. It also shows that God's people can do nothing without him through Sinai. And then Deuteronomy is more of a summary of what happened to Israel, as well as a foreshadowing of things to come. The history books are themed by deliverance, and they cover the history of God's continual rescue of his people. It covers books like Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as well as Esther. It's very rich in historical stories that continue to encourage people today. The poetic books are more of an expression between God and his people, both ways, of communion and a desire for unity. So we see in Proverbs a theme of wisdom. It has a more mechanical view of life. Ecclesiastes shows that God lets us go through times of trial, and even when everything seems useless and vain, we can cling to the Lord and find our purpose there. And Psalms is crowned as the poetic book of the whole Bible. It gives general wisdom, deliverance in time of need. The poetic books actually compose 1/3 of the Old Testament, making them pretty important despite their symbolism and poetry. Hebrew poetry actually uses fewer words, but carefully chosen words, and so these books meant quite a bit to the people in some of the trials that they faced. The prophetic books are themed by trials. These are books where God reveals his nature and design through men, and he uses devout men to test Israel and beckon his people back to his ways. God reveals himself through men, and it is divided by the major and minor prophets. The consummation is the New Testament, and this is where Jesus is revealed as the great awaited Messiah. Next, we have the great patriarchies of the Old Testament, beginning with Abraham, who was the first to receive the great promise that his descendants would outnumber the stars of the sky, and he would be the father of many nations. Then we have Isaac, who is the famous child that Abraham took up the mountain to offer as a sacrifice to God when God graciously intervened and provided a ram. His name also means laughter because Sarah, his mother, laughed when she heard that she was going to bear a son due to her old age. Then we have Jacob, who is the one who wrestled with God. He's also the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, and his name was changed to Israel when God appeared to him. Then we have Joseph, who is the son of Jacob from his wife Rachel, and he is the one who could interpret great dreams. His brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt, but through that, God elevated him to a position of power. And possibly one of my favorite verses in the Old Testament is Exodus 50:20, which talks about what the enemy meant for evil, what his brothers meant for evil against him, God meant for good. And then it goes on to say, for the very purpose of preserving the life of many, So Joseph knew that his purpose in staying faithful to God was because God wanted to preserve the life of the surrounding nations of Egypt, the people in Egypt, as well as the lineage of Jesus through the life of Judah, one of his brothers. And Joseph's life continues to speak of God's promises to provide a great sacrifice one day through the life of Jesus that would atone for our sins. Next, we have the Apocrypha, which are 7 other books written during the silent 400 years, which are the years between the Old Testament and the writing of the New Testament. Reasons to distrust the Apocrypha is that it diminishes the power of the resurrection. It claims that prayers can be made for the dead, which we know is not true because of Luke 16:25, where Abraham addresses men cannot pass in and out of torment. Despite it being uninspired, it is still a useful text that we can use as a historical book, and something that we can use to confirm the things that are inspired. Why read the Old Testament? Some reasons for this is because Jesus read the Old Testament. The disciples also quoted and knew Old Testament scriptures, and so we should too, as ones who follow them as they followed Christ. Paul also knew the Hebrew Bible well, being a studier of the law, and the Old Testament books prophesy of our Messiah, Jesus. Some reflection questions is what makes the Old Testament life-giving in our devotion to Christ? And where can you find Jesus in the Old Testament? The more we look for him, the more we'll find him, and he assures us that as we seek him, he will be found by us, which is a worthy reason to read the Old Testament.